Welcome to the Minnesota Board of Psychology's 2019 Spring Conference. Our agenda for this part of the presentation, we're going to talk about the mission, composition, and duties of the board, so kind of why we do the things that we do. Then we'll look at documentation that's related to the postdoctoral supervised experience. Hopefully at the end of this you'll be able to identify things that should be going into your supervision file and your supervision logs, and make the whole point of this conference is to make this part of the conference is to make a smoother application process for the applicants and the licensees. And I think that we can do that by explaining our processes, telling you what the board is really looking for when we have these different documents, and making sure that, as you're aware, you can start including those things or continue to include them.
And we're also going to just make this a conversation. So we're going to be talking about ways to try to make what you do match what the board requires, but we are in no way establishing rules. So there's your qualification.
That's right, yeah. If you have questions about the actual rule, we'll refer you to the rules and statutes themselves. So then, after that, we'll talk about the general postdoctoral supervision concerns. So what are the common things that we see that hold applications up? And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some specific areas of opportunities, things that you could include in supervision files that will really make that process of applying for your postdoc go much smoother. So mission of the board: Minnesota Board of Psychology protects the public through licensure, regulation, and education to promote access to safe, competent, and ethical psychological services. The board members really believe in this mission, and how all of our work derives from being connected to this mission about protecting the public through licensure, regulation, and education. So this particular presentation is going to hit on all three of those categories. Licensure, obviously we're talking about supervision here. Regulation, we do have the regulatory component with regards to the complaint review process. And then education, because one of our real goals here is to just bring some sunlight to what the board does, and really help foster a conversation between us and the community, and get us all on the same page. So the composition of the board, by the numbers, we have 11 board members. They're appointed by the governor. They serve 3-year terms. We have 8 psychologist members. We have 3 public members. We have many committees. The ones we'll go, I'll let you know, is Application Review Committee, Complaint Review Committee, Rules, Legislative, Administrative, and PRE Testing. This time I didn't forget the Rules Committee. They all do important work, and they're all staffed, staffed by board members. They all have at least 2 professional members and 1 public member. So that's common to all of our boards, that we like to have the expertise of our professionals that can drive our decisions, but also the public members serve a really important role in making sure that our mission to protect the public is fulfilled. So these are the duties of the board. This is all outlined in statute. We regulate we're the gatekeeper of the profession through licensure. We regulate the practice of psychology. We issue, renew licenses, and collect fees. And we provide an avenue for the public to file a complaint if they've had what they believe to be service that isn't provided competently. And then educate the public about board rules. All right. So we'll start with postdoctoral documenting postdoc supervision. So improper or inadequate supervision is the 7th most reported reason for disciplinary action by licensing boards. Is anybody surprised by this in this room? Yeah, some people are. So that's pretty high up on the order of disciplinary things. Things that are going to be above it are like boundaries issues or incompetent practice, but 7 is is quite a, is up there. And so that's why this topic is especially important, because we want to try and educate the supervisors and supervisees to avoid some of the potential actions that could happen.
So I want to put this in a context.
Yeah.
Think about what supervision is, the postdoc year of supervision. I think people finish their degree, they've finished their predoctoral internship, and they're ready to hit the ground running. They're very confident, they feel really good, and they really want to get started. But there's still another year of training that our profession has said people need to have. So I really want you to think about that postdoc year as the final year of training. So for people who take on the role of supervisor, you're taking on the responsibility for this applicant's or this supervisee's last year of development in their identity as a psychologist and in their ability to provide the kind of psychological services in a competent way that we want to see. And then for the applicant or the supervisee, this is your last chance to have this kind of safety net while you're doing practice. And it's really about figuring out what's left for you to develop. So it's not just a year where you're going to hit the ground and do practice and that's it, you're ready to go. It really is another year of development. And so everything that we talk about, we want you to think about it in those terms.
Right. So, what is a postdoc supervised experience? Under the statutes, and I forgot to mention, one of the challenges that I'm going to try and challenge myself to do is not to speak in lawyer talk, in legal language as much as I can. I am a recovering attorney, so I will slip into that every once in a while, but I'm really going to try and talk in plain language as much as I can. So under the rules, postdoc, post-degree supervised experiences, paid or volunteer experience that has professional oversight by a primary supervisor, and then meets the requirements of statutes and rules that we have around supervision. And supervision is the documented in-person consultation that can be interactive visual electronic communication designed for supervision for licensing purposes.
And it really has two goals, that postdoc year. For the supervisor, you're providing the supervision to help the psychologist develop, so it's their final year of training, but you're also supposed to be providing clinical oversight for the work that they do so that we are protecting the public.
Right. And so, really to drive, I think, that point home is we really take the word of the supervisor attesting that the person is competent to practice by themselves very seriously with the board, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So how much post-degree experience is required? 1 full year of full or the full-time or the equivalent part-time. So that's 12 months. The time work can be paid or unpaid, doesn't really matter. But it has to be 1,800 hours that you accrue in a time frame that's no less than 12 months. And then we have no more than 60 months here. So our statute allows us some flexibility for our applicants to have life happen, to step away from the practice of psychology if they would like, to do some things like that and still be eligible for licensing down the road. We need 1 hour of primary supervision per week. Let's just put that into real simple terms. If the supervisee sees one client for 1 hour, they need to have 1 hour of primary supervision for that week. If they have 20 hours, they still only need 1 hour. If they have 21 hours, they need 2 hours of supervision. The board never requires you to have more than 2 hours of supervision. And we cap the number of hours that count per week at 50 hours per week. However, I would just encourage supervisors to say, if you feel like your supervisee needs additional supervision during that week, there is nothing that prevents you from providing additional supervision if they're having tough cases or if there's other reasons that you want to have 3 hours of supervision. We just don't require it as the board.
Right. So there's where your role as clinical oversight becomes really important. If you feel like this clinical situation or this supervisee needs additional hours of supervision in order for you to feel comfortable because it's your license they're practicing under, that service is going to be competent, then you can go ahead and provide that additional supervision. I also want to keep in mind, I know in some sites where people are doing their postdocs, they're working more than 50 hours a week, and while we don't require that you have more than 2 hours a week of supervision, this supervisee's work is on your license, and if something goes wrong, it's your license that will be looked at. And so you want to make sure that the clinical oversight you're providing, that you feel okay that it's enough, all right?
Right. So there's a difference between what we're going to require them to demonstrate to us and what you might feel comfortable having them do. And then so the primary supervisor has to be either a doctoral level psychologist or a master's level psychologist who is licensed prior to 1991, October 1st, 1991. The second hour is loosened up a little bit about who can provide that supervision. This person we call, if the primary supervisor can either do a second hour of individual with themselves, or if they want to try and steer the supervisee to get an additional skill set from another provider, they can do that as well. That person then becomes the designated supervisor. The designated supervisor is a behavioral health professional. Any of those people can serve as a supervisor for the psychologist for that second hour, but only doctoral licensed psychologist for the first hour or the master's level that qualify.
So I just want to put this in simple terms.
Sure.
So not the legalese and not all the details. So if you're doing your postdoc, you have to do 1,800 hours and it has to be a year. There's leeway to make that more flexible so that you can use more than a year's amount of time, but you have to get 1,800 hours. Basically, if you're working full-time, you have to get 2 hours a week of supervision. And one of those hours needs to be with a doctoral level psychologist, basically, with some minor exceptions built in. So, and the point of that, I believe, is about helping you develop, if you're a supervisee, helping the supervisee develop an identity as a psychologist and doing psychological practice. But there's also then the opportunity to have another supervisor rather than the same supervisor so that they can develop additional expertise or can be supervised by someone that like in a group setting, for example. So the first hour needs to be individual, one-on-one, face-to-face, or using the equivalent of FaceTime or Google Duo, because you can do telesupervision. But 1 hour individual with a doctoral level psychologist. And the second hour has the option to include another licensed behavioral health professional, and it can be in group rather than individual settings. So.
Yep. So, and then the last point we want to make about this documentation piece is that the supervisee, there needs to be continuing supervision, as described above, after the point that they complete their postdoc. So, there's two different statuses. You're either licensed in independent practice, you don't need to be supervised, not licensed, need to be supervised. All right, so let's talk about what the board expects from supervisors. So the board expects that the supervisor understands and abides by the requirements in statute and rule. We also require, so for competency, we also require the competent provision of supervision. So obviously, in your regular practice, when you're providing some kind of service, the rules require that you do that in a competent manner. When you're supervising somebody who's providing psychological services, you need to be competent not only in the area that the supervisee is providing services, but also in supervision. And there are board rules about how to develop competencies, and I'll let you look those up to figure out what those are.
But basically, just like any other clinical practice that you would do, we want you to be competent to provide supervision. So way back in the day when I was in grad school, I had to take a class in supervision. We had a practicum in supervision. Providing supervised service to people earlier in their training cycle was part of my internship. So those are the kinds of things that we might be looking for you to say, okay, that's a competency that I have.
Right, absolutely. And so then what the board expects of supervisors is that they document the total hours of supervision provided and also document the total hours of time that the licensee or the supervisee worked under the licensee's supervision. And this goes back to, if you don't document it, it didn't happen.
Right. I think some people figure if I'm going to be like, in some settings, there's a primary supervisor, and then there's someone we call a designated supervisor. And this is where we get confused with the legal language and kind of the common use of the term. So technically, legally, designated supervisor means the primary supervisor said, you go do that supervision. But in reality, what often happens is they're assigned by someone in administration or some other variation of that. But when you take on the role of primary supervisor, we're expecting that you're going to be the person that's going to make sure it all happens according to the way it's supposed to happen. The licensee also has to do that, but we don't want supervisors to be off the hook for making sure, because you're the person that supervisee is turning to for guidance. You're the one that needs to be providing oversight to make sure the rules are being followed. So with a designated supervisor then, if you're responsible for the entire supervised experience because you've taken on the role of primary supervisor, it's important for you to talk with the other people who are doing supervision. Because, for example, there may be particular areas of development that a particular supervisee may still need, and if you guys aren't communicating, then that may never happen. So we're wanting you to work together as a team, just like a clinical team might work together.
Absolutely. And I would say, the board understands that in especially larger organizations, the primary supervisor may not get to choose who they designate, right? And an administrator may say, this is the group supervision that we want this supervisee to go to. That doesn't preclude the supervisor from saying, that is the person that I also designate as the designated supervisor. And thinking of it that way so that there's not miscommunication, misunderstanding between us and the licensee. Dr. McLeod covered the communication and how key that is for the primary supervisor to collaborate and control really that primary communication. And then finally, retain responsibility for all of the professional experience that occurs underneath that supervision. So clinically responsible for what that supervisee does when you're supervising them.
Okay, so how many of you in here are supervisors? How many of you in here are supervisees? Okay, so we have mostly a room of supervisors. So we expect that people so your supervisees ought to know these things, but as a supervisor, you kind of have to keep tabs on that and make sure that they're up on that. It's one of the ways that we're enculturating people to pay attention to their board statutes and rules. So we want to make sure that applicants know all of the rules and statutes. How many of you read the rules and statutes prior to applying for your license? Nice, okay. I teach a class of fourth-year doctoral students, and they hardly have looked at that at all. So, until they get in my class. Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. So, in addition to just knowing what the rules are and having an understanding of that, we need the supervisee to document the total hours worked as well as the hours of supervision that they received. Now, this third point, this isn't something that's required, but it really is, I think, a best practice, and so I wanted to highlight it from that perspective, is as your supervised experience changes, like let's say you move from one postdoc experience to another, or you're doing a rotation. If you let the board know that you've finished with one experience, the board can then start the work of verifying that experience from that supervisor and catalog that away on your application, so that at the time that you're all finished with the work that you're doing, there's less verification for us to do. It just kind of helps us smooth that licensing process out and make it a little bit quicker. And then it is the applicant's responsibility to demonstrate how they met the licensing requirements. And this goes back to the documentation comment that I made, is how do you demonstrate that you met the requirements? One of the easiest ways is to provide the documentation of the supervision and of the hours that you worked. And so that's one of the real key reasons why it's important to really keep good documentation about this experience, both from the supervisee and the supervisor. And then, again, continuing to be supervised after completing the postdoctoral hours and maintaining that supervision until the license is granted.
So this is one of the areas I think that can be kind of tricky for folks. They feel like I've completed my 1,800 hours, I did my 1 year, I've got all my requirements met, so I'm going to submit that, but now I can go ahead and practice. And you want to be really careful that you're not doing what is called practicing psychology without a license. So until you're licensed, you have to be supervised. There's still some gray area in there in terms of what level of supervision. And in general, what we're suggesting is that you continue the same level of supervision that you've had until you get your license. That's your safest bet. There are some people who change their job title to mental health practitioner and follow DHS guidelines. Just make sure that you're doing it that way if that's the route you're going to go.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's talk about the types of documents that we get from supervisees and supervisors. So supervisees, they complete the application, which includes documenting all of the postdoc experience that they have. If they have a change in their postdoc experience, they submit a supervision amendment. That can be for something as simple as, I took this job and I thought it was going to be 12 months and I was going to work 2,000 hours. And instead, I worked for 16 months and did 2,400 hours. Well, we need to know, what you're submitting for that work, and so we have an amendment form that you can fill out, that applicants can fill out, to let us know about that change, so that we can know what to expect from the supervisor. And then the final thing is just to respond to any requests for additional information and documents that we might ask for. From the supervisors, we require that they complete the supervision attestation in a timely manner. This is one thing that can hold up the licensing process, that the supervisor doesn't submit the verification or attestation that we request. And that's something that we're really focusing on in terms of trying to get the applicant through the application process as quickly as we can with maintaining the standards. And then again, responding to the additional documentation or information requests. So if something isn't clear, we will ask you about what we think, what's unclear to us.
So one of the things we're trying to do is make the application process as seamless as possible and take as little time as possible. Mm-hmm. So the things that we're talking about and that we're going to go into more depth on is, how do you keep that process going smooth and fast? And if you're doing all of these things, providing the documentation, making sure that those things match up, and for supervisors, that when you get the email from the board that says, please go to this link and fill out this form, that you take 10 minutes out of your day that day and get it done, then that keeps the application going in the process. So technically, if everything is there, there's no glitches or hiccups, then it can be within 30 days the license is done. And think about that. If you have to continue supervision at the same level until your license happens, you want to do as much possible up front not to slow that process down, because that kind of supervision is expensive.
All right. And I'll say that, once we have the documentation that we need, it takes about 2 weeks, 2 weeks to 3 weeks for us to move that licensee through the 2 final reviews that we need to do for their application. So once we have the documents, we're able to get that through pretty quick. So I wanted to go through some documents that we use as the board staff to try and verify and certify a postdoctoral experience. So these are the 2 sheets that you would have picked up at the table back here. The first one looks somewhat like this. This is called our supervision amendment form. We use this form anytime somebody wants to change some aspect of their postdoc. So we ensure that the applicant submits information that's relevant to their experience that might have changed since they last communicated with the board about their experience. As you can see, There's a lot of information for them to fill out here. I draw your attention to specific duties. So this is where they write out what exactly they've done and that it's the practice of psychology. So the board, as board staff, we need to know that what they're asking to have counted is actually the practice of psychology. There's a definition and the definitions of what the practice is, and that's hyperlinked there. And so you can go and look and kind of use those keywords to describe what your experience actually was.
So what you don't want to put there is postdoctoral fellowship or postdoctoral residency, because those words don't appear anywhere in the Practice Act as defining the practice of psychology. So go look at the words of how our statute defines the practice of psychology and make sure those words appear there.
That's right. So like if you're providing psychotherapy, if you're doing assessments,
Yep.
anything like that, that's
Teaching
all.
a class.
Teaching a psychology class. Those are all in the definition of the practice of psychology. Make sure that those things make it into the description. So then we ask if the applicant wants this information, these hours that they completed, counted. So in order to count, they must be the practice of psychology. And then, so if somebody says no in this part, then we ask them to go to the next box, which says, is that, could that experience be considered the practice of psychology? So there are a lot of exemptions to the Practice Act. And there is a lot of, let's say, scope overlap, where it wouldn't be called the practice of psychology that an LPCC does something, but our scope of practice overlaps, and that person might have an LPCC license.
There's a lot of examples.
Right.
So many times people have a master's level license, LPCC, LMFT, LICSW, and if they're working under that license, then that would be one of the times that even though the duties of the job also fit the definition of the practice of psychology, they're practicing under one of those exemptions. And we just want them to tell us which exemption are you doing that under. Because remember, you're not supposed to practice without a license or without adequate supervision.
Right. And so that's a great point. And essentially we've put this in here, this little box, to make sure that not only is it clear to us which exemption, if an applicant's asking for it to be exempt, why they believe it's exempt, but also gets the applicant to think about, makes the choice about whether it is an exempt activity or not. So those are the documents that we have with applicants, and on the back side you'll see that there's a big space for you to write why you're asking for the change. I would just say provide the reason that you're making the change and leave it at that. We'll contact you if we have more questions about it.
And just because there's a big space there does not mean you have to fill it. Really,
Right.
It could just be one sentence or even a
Right.
clause just to explain why.
Right. Yeah, it could just be, in the example that I gave previously, I ended up working extra months, and I have 2,400 hours now instead of 2,000. Done.
I was working under an LPCC license.
Yep.
Done. Period.
Done. It doesn't need to be, a narrative about everything that happened with that experience. So now let's talk about the documentation that we have as it relates to what we get from the supervisor. So staff reviews the supervision attestation, which is the other document that you have. It's a 2-page document. And we ask supervisors to fill these out and to get these back to us. Now, I just want to say a little bit about a process change that we've had in the last little bit. I think it's almost a year now. So we treat this attestation by the supervisor very similarly to the way we treat a transcript from a university. That's how seriously we take the word of the supervisor. So, for instance, if an applicant tells us that they graduated from the University of St. Thomas, and maybe even send us their transcript, that's all well and good, but we don't accept that as primary source. We require the university to send us a transcript directly to verify that. So we look from this from the supervisee's perspective, we look at the total hours that they say that they're working. From the supervisor's perspective, we ask many more questions of the supervisor to make sure that the experience that this applicant had was an experience that meets our requirements.
So one of the things I would ask you to do is take a look at the items on the attestation form, because you as a supervisor, these are the things that you have to attest to for each of your supervisees, attest to the board that these things happen. And it kind of outlines exactly what you're supposed to have been doing during that supervisory year. So.
Absolutely. And, you can just see the questions that we ask. And if you were to just, I think, take these questions and kind of apply them to your supervisory relationship, you would end up being having a pretty good set of documents that you could competently tell the board that this person's ready to practice.
So I know attestation has a legal meaning, but basically what you're saying is, I promise that this really did happen.
Right.
If there was ever a question and we need to say, did it really happen? One of the rules I know I was taught in training, if you don't document, then it didn't happen. So you need to be documenting supervision along the way. So one of the things that I do, I enter all my supervisees as a patient in our electronic health record system, and I use a procedure code called supervision, and it gets documented in the electronic health record. I have a note form that I fill out very similarly to a progress note, where I just make a real brief summary of what we talked about. I have check boxes to make it fast, because I don't write a big long narrative of what we said, talk about topics that we covered, and then anything that the supervisee is going to do as a follow-up from our meeting. So that documentation is there, and I can run a quick report in my EHR. It gives me all the dates that we met, the times that we met. I say we met in my note, I'll say we met for an hour, face-to-face at this office, that location. So I'm documenting that it happened.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So this form is what we use, and we also provide some, we understand that people get sick, people go on vacation, things like that, and so we provide some boxes in the bottom to kind of tell us, if supervision was missed for 1 week, that's not going to be the end of the world. Just let us know that it happened, and if that was made up, when it was made up, or if somebody else provided that supervision, who that person was.
So I have a supervision sub that I use. So this is another doctoral level psychologist, and if for some reason I'm sick or I'm out of town or I'm at a conference, my supervisee continues to work full time, then she needs to have that hour of individual and the hour and a half of group. That's the way we do it at our clinic. And so I have other people who are going to step in for me and do those things. Doctoral level supervisor for the one-on-one face-to-face. And that's set up ahead of time, and then that becomes part of the documentation. So while I may not have met with her every single week for that 1 hour, I know that someone did. And if for some reason that person can't, then I'm going to try to make that up the next week and do extra supervision the following week. What we don't want to see is weeks and weeks of no individual supervision by someone who qualifies as a primary supervisor.
That's right, yeah. So now that we've talked a little bit about the documents that the board staff uses and what we're kind of looking for, let's talk about what staff does when we can't certify the postdoc supervision as meeting our requirements. So I'm just going to give a brief history of this. The board has the authority to review the supervised experience, but not a good use of the board's members' time to come once a month and just review supervision. We might not get any other business done that week. So the board then delegates to staff the ability to review and approve applicants and their supervision and get them licensed. It really helps us get people licensed in between board meetings. But the caveat is that we're not psychologists. The staff, there's not a psychologist on staff. If we're going to approve supervision, it has to fit in our nice little neat box that the board members have given to us and says that if it's like this, then absolutely it meets the requirement and you guys can license them. We don't, as staff, feel comfortable working on the margins and making judgment calls about whether something meets the requirement or not. So those things, then we have to try and resolve them if it's at the margins. And again, the board and the application review committee meet once a month, so we try and do all of this work in between those time periods so that if the board or a committee does need to make a decision, that they have all of the documentation that they need in order to make a decision at that meeting so that we don't hold up the licensing process.
So if it fits in a box, it's
Yep,
sped through the process.
sped through the process. So what can slow down the process? Okay, supervisors that are in the attestation listing supervision or hours worked that are less than what the applicant is claiming. So for instance, if the applicant says they worked 1,800 hours and the supervisor said it was 1,200, well, you know, we have an issue. What happened with the 600 hours? Did the supervisor just make a clerical error in writing that down? Could be. Or, you know, was there some work that was done by the applicant that the supervisor didn't know was happening? And so we need to kind of sort that out. You know, the reverse is something that we can handle. If the supervisee says it was 1,200 hours and the supervisor says it was 1,400 hours, not a problem, because we know that at least those 1,200 hours were supervised. So the attestation by the supervisor has ambiguous information about supervision hours. So one of the examples that I give is they say they didn't designate a supervisor, but then they list a person who provided designated supervision. And so we're not clear, was that designated supervision? Did they actually designate it back to this?
So this is an example of where psychologists can get trapped by legal language. So did you designate a did you designate another supervisor? What does it say?
Right. Yeah.
Right? And so you may not have designated, okay, I pick you to do it. It may actually have been an administrator in your clinic that said, this person's going to do the designated supervision, you're going to do the primary. So technically, because we're honest people and we want to tell the truth, some people will say, no, I didn't designate. Somebody else did. But that somebody else did isn't on there. So really, it's about, did you know there was a designated supervisor? Were you aware of them? Were you collaborating with them? Were you working together to develop this supervisor? Those are the kinds of things that question's trying to get at. Was there a designated supervisor?
Right, exactly. So then applicant fails to describe in adequate detail their duties. This goes back to the fellowship thing.
The fourth one then is that sometimes what happens in some clinics is the supervisee will start, let's say, on September 1st, but the first supervision meeting doesn't happen until some later time period, let's say September 15th. So there's 2 weeks in there where there was not supervision provided. We just want an explanation of that needs to make some sense. If they weren't seeing any clients until later on when the supervision took place, then that's not a problem. If they started seeing clients day one, but it took 2 weeks for them to get supervision, then that's a problem. So just think about, when is your supervisee going to be actually seeing clients? You know, I have my supervisees for most of their first month, they're shadowing me. And actually, every time they're shadowing me, they're with me in the session. I'm supervising them in that meeting. Mm-hmm. I'm there with them. We have the ability to then debrief about that. So those times count, even though it's not a supervision session.
Right. And so what I would say about that is that there are valid reasons for people to start a program that they wouldn't get supervision for, up to 4 weeks. The Department of Corrections has a 4-week training program that they put their psychologists through before they can see clients. We just, as the board, we need to have that just explained to us in a manner that makes sense. That I wasn't seeing clients, I was doing a training program. This is when I started seeing clients. So this is when supervision started. There's nothing wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We just, if we don't get that explanation, then we wonder, we want to make sure that experience is supervised.
So then what happens is it just slows the process down, because then we have to turn around and ask for that information, wait for it to come back in. And so even if everything's cool, it just takes longer.
Absolutely, and that's what we're trying to avoid here. So here's what we do when we're trying to resolve these issues with either an applicant and supervisee. we request additional attestations. So we'll send these attestations out to supervisors. They'll submit them. Maybe there's something that wasn't clear from their submission. So we'll go back and say, you know, you wrote down that you supervised 12 hours of work. Did you mean that you provided 12 hours of, did you mean you provided 12 hours of supervision, or did they really only work for 12 hours? And so we'll try and clear it up, and we'll be pretty clear about what is missing without telling people what they need to put in there. And then if through a couple back and forths with this, we can't quite get a grasp that the supervision experience clearly meets our requirements, what we'll do is we'll request supervision logs and the supervision file. So at that point, what we're going to try and do is say, okay, maybe you're not understanding the questions that we're asking. So we're just going to match the documents and go through and give you credit for what meets our requirements, and then figure out if there's something that doesn't meet our requirements, then that would go to the application review committee to kind of review.
So one of the things that people think happens is after they finish their doctoral program, remember in practicum and internship, you had to log your hours. You had to log how many testing hours you did, how many direct client contact hours, how many hours of supervision. Those logs, it's important for you to continue those logs through the postdoc experience so that you have that kind of record. Remember, if you don't document, it can be argued that it didn't happen. And then as supervisors, I think it's really important to keep tabs on your supervisee doing that, keeping those kinds of logs and keeping them up to date. It's way easier to do a log as you go than it is at the end of the year to look back and say, okay, what did we do? So one of the things I've done to make that process simple is we've created a Google spreadsheet so it can be shared and it can be live. I put my supervisees, they're responsible for recording the data. So date of supervision, who it was with, how long it was, from what time to what time. What type of supervision, individual, primary, group, designated, those kinds of things are logged on that spreadsheet. And then my job as supervisor is to periodically go in and verify that what's being entered there matches up with what I'm documenting from what I'm doing.
Right. And absolutely, that is a best practice to do that in real time, to try and make sure that you're communicating with your supervisee so you're on the same page about what supervision is happening, what took place, and to make sure that those hours are being documented. So if we can't, through these methods, if we can't, resolve any of the issues, if we can't certify all of the experience, and that's the other thing that I didn't mention. If we're going to certify the experience of staff, we have to certify all of it, or we have to take it to the ARC, because we can't say, okay, they have enough hours that count, but then there's these 7 or 8 weeks, whatever, that don't meet our requirements, but we're going to just count the ones that do. We have to take it to the ARC to make sure we know what to do with those
ARC
weeks.
is Application Review
Thank
Committee.
Thank you. So then the Application Review Committee, I won't go into much detail about this. We take any files that we can't certify to an Application Review Committee. There are 2 doctoral psychologists and a public member that review these files, and they have a range of decision points that they can make. If they can't, if ARC, the Application Review Committee, decides that it's a pretty major issue and they feel like it needs to go to the Complaint Resolution Committee, or if the conduct described in all of the documents that we receive from the applicant and the supervisee show that it is completely out of whack with what the state requires, or if there's boundaries violations or other things, then some of those will go directly to the Complaint Resolution Committee, but it's very rare that those do go there these days. So then we do have that coming up, so I will just say that there is a lot of tools that the CRC has to understand what happened during that experience. So, general postdoctoral supervision concerns and specific opportunities. So we've gone through quite a few of these, but just to make sure that we drive the point home, starting the postdoc before all the degree requirements are met is not something that can be done in Minnesota. So you need to have finished everything you need to do for your doctoral degree in order to start accruing postdoc hours. Supervisors deferring responsibility.
I'll do that.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's where I think this actually was, if you look back at the history of supervision in the development of the profession of psychology, and then as licensure came to be known, I think it was kind of the onus was put on the applicant to make sure they met all of their required hours to become licensed. And psychology and the practice of psychology has evolved from that, so that we didn't used to have to document supervision, not when I was trained, but now we do, and there's an expectation that you're documenting that. There's also an expectation that you are taking responsibility that they're meeting the requirements. So if you're going to take on the role of primary supervisor, you're providing oversight, and kind of administrative oversight to make sure they're meeting the requirements. You're also providing true clinical oversight. So I'm going to skip to that one since we're on it. True clinical oversight. So there are some situations where, for example, a primary supervisor will be hired by a clinic to supervise a postdoc that's in that clinic. But the primary supervisor is not an employee of that clinic. So it's just a contract to provide that supervision. If you're in that kind of a situation, you need to make sure that you have what we consider to be true clinical oversight. You need to have access to the records of the clients that your supervisee is seeing, and you need to have the opportunity to directly observe the work of your supervisee. So to observe a session, to listen to recordings. You can't just meet for 1 hour a week and say, I did my thing, that's all I'm responsible for. It's a lot more than that.
Absolutely. So another thing that we see, it's a common pitfall that elongates the application process is people are missing that second hour of supervision, some weeks or maybe all weeks. And then also just the supervisors not communicating together. So it's demonstrated in the paperwork that there wasn't a lot of communication between the primary supervisor and the designated supervisor. And so that is problematic from the board's perspective.
It's kind of like two therapists working with the same client.
Right.
You would want to make sure you talk to each other.
Right. And then finally, reducing the level of supervision after the 1,800 hours are completed, or not having supervision at all and continuing to practice.
Yeah.
So finally, specific opportunities for this group is, make sure that if the supervision doesn't start at the time of employment or within, a week or so, a week or two of that you explain to the board when you submit your application why that is. Make sure you're starting your postdoc after you've completed all the requirements for your degree. Really from the applicant's perspective, making sure that you as an applicant understand who your primary supervisor is and having only those people listed on the application, because sometimes we will get designated supervisors, and when we send them the primary supervision attestation, it comes back very confusing for us and causes a lot of spinning the wheels on our part. And then I would just say, all of these things, we're just trying to smooth out the pathway, because at each board meeting, we have a section, it's one of my favorite parts, where we report to the full board about the number of people that we've licensed since the last board meeting. And I can tell you, our staff loves it when those lists are long. It feels really good to have a lot of people licensed in that last time frame. It feels really good to have us feel like we're making a difference in terms of getting competent providers out into the world that can help Minnesotans with their mental health. And we really, really value that. And what we're trying to do here is to just make sure that everybody's on the same page and minimize that time that it takes for them, for applicants to get licensed.
So really what he's saying is that the board staff, and I believe board members as well, we really want to make this process work. Everyone's intentions are really good. Mm-hmm. There are statutes and rules that have to be followed, and we're trying to see how to make it work. And where along the way do people hit glitches that we can help smooth out by talking about it more. So now we have questions.
Now we have time for questions.
And we have an open mic.
Don't be afraid.
Can you come to the
Can you
mic?
come to the mic so that the,
We need you to come to the mic because we're recording it, and we want to be able to capture the questions and the answers on the video recording. Yeah.
yeah, by all means.
So I worked in a setting where it may be the case that a trainee will come and not really intend to practice in Minnesota. And then after a time, they may get a job in Minnesota. So they would not have submitted anything to the board because, and the reason I'm asking this, it sounds as though someone should actually submit an application early on in their postdoctoral year. Is that correct?
Well, so they don't have to. People don't have to submit an application until they're ready to apply for licensing.
The reason I asked this question is you were talking about a document about amending.
Sure.
So what would they be amending?
Sure. So that's a great question. In order to sit for one of the examinations, the EPPP or the PRE, we have to have an application that's complete on file. So at that point in time, somebody might fill out information about their experience and give us the documents related to taking the exam. If they happen to fill out the information related to their postdoc supervision, right, then they would need to amend that part of the application with us.
So for example, a postdoc at the beginning of their year, say they want to take the EPPP a couple of months in because we know the research shows that the closer to your coursework you take the EPPP, the greater the probability that you're going to pass it. So they want to take it during that year, so they fill out all of the bubbles online and they pay their fee and they hit submit. But at that point, they're not reporting true numbers for their postdoc, they're reporting an estimate for that. So at the end of their postdoc year, then they want to go back in, file an amendment so that it more accurately reflects, because otherwise, once they've passed those exams and they hit whatever button says, okay, I'm ready, and it goes to the supervisor,
Right.
if they said 1,800 hours, and if they say 2,000 hours and I say 1,836, that's going to be a glitch that slows it down. So they need to get the accurate numbers in at the end of the year, if they started it early.
But if somebody is doing this after the fact,
Not
that's
a problem.
perfectly acceptable.
Right.
Yeah.
Then they would just report what they actually worked at that point in time.
Second question, what does the board consider well-done supervisory documentation? I mean, by the supervisor.
The board doesn't clarify that, so my recommendation is that you look at DHS guidelines for what they're requiring. I mean, the board has kind of some things about it says some language in there in rule, I think, but it's not like bullet points like what I said I'd do, right? But I developed what I do based on reading the statute and rule. So you're basically saying that whether it was group or individual, how long it lasted, what the date was, where you met, that it was face-to-face or telesupervision,
Right.
those kinds of things. And then kind of a really vague summary of what you talked about.
And I would say that if you look at what the the questions that we're asking, if you have documentation to back up all of the things that you say yes to, you're on a
And
good
like, for
track.
example, if I'm talking with one of my supervisors, if they have a client who has suicidal ideation, we're going to be talking about that. I'm also going to document that in their record because that's one of the things that DHS requires. So there's kind of additional documentation that you could have.
Right. Thank you for those questions. Other questions? Please.
I was going to write it down, but I'll just ask it quick. Could you explain the difference between question 5 and 6 on the
Sure.
supervisory form?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm reading them and they sound like the same thing. So
We
I
had
just
that
wanna
same
make
question
sure.
this morning.
Right.
Okay.
So question 5 just says, as the supervisor, I understand how much my supervisee is working under my supervision. I'm sorry.
On the supervisor attestation form, questions 5 and 6, it's on the back, I think.
And then that you also provided the supervision necessary for that number of hours in that week. That's basically getting towards, you really have a grasp on what the supervisee is doing on your license. And then question number 6 is getting at the individual one-on-one supervision that's required of the primary supervisor. So remember, we said that there's two different types of 2 different hours of supervision, and that the first hour has to be by the primary face-to-face, which can include the Google Duo or FaceTime.
And individual, not group.
An individual, not group. So that's the difference between those. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, I was actually talking about the additional information questions. I did not clarify, I apologize.
Okay.
Number
Yeah,
5
yeah,
and 6 that talk about
Sure.
when you missed an hour due to illness or something.
Yep. Okay. So
They
yeah, yeah,
sound
yeah.
like the same question to me.
So these are additional information. So what you do is you look at question number 5. And if you can say yes most of the time, but there are a few exceptions, then you go down to the corresponding box and write in kind of what the narrative is about, about that.
So third week of September, we missed supervision. I was out of town at a conference. My colleague filled in. My colleague's credentials are.
Right. Or, supervisor got sick, or supervisee got sick on Friday. Friday's our normal day that we have supervision. We had supervision on Monday, the next Monday.
Or 2 hours the following Friday.
Right. Exactly. Any other? Oh, yes, great.
I have a couple questions. One is a follow-up to that and has to do with the label designated supervisor versus when you are out of town or sick and someone steps in for you. What is the correct label for what you were referring to as a sub?
I would say because I'm the primary supervisor, it needs to be somebody who meets the criteria or qualifications of a primary supervisor. So it needs to be someone who basically has a doctoral degree in psychology.
So I understand the qualifications, but what label should we use on the form if we're referring to them? Because designated sounds a little bit different than that, or is it also a designated?
So what I would just do is if, I wouldn't actually label them. I would just, in the box, you can just fill out that this person with this credential supervised that week.
Don't get too hung up on the legalese.
Yeah.
Okay, or if it was multiple weeks because I'm
Right.
fortunate to have good vacation
Absolutely.
policy.
I was on
It could be
maternity
a
leave
couple
for
people.
6 weeks or
Okay.
8 weeks, and so-and-so filled in for me. Fulfilling the role, you could say fulfilling the role of primary supervisor
Right.
if you wanted to.
Right.
Say it
Okay.
that way.
And then I'm just verifying, it is the case that you can have a makeup supervision hour the next week. I guess I didn't
Yes.
understand that. So you can have,
Right.
you could have 0 one week and 4 hours the next and still count both weeks.
What we would not want to see is that to be the practice for the entire year.
Okay. But
Can't do
occasionally.
4
that's
hours a
okay.
month at one time.
Right.
And then you also said they shouldn't be calling, if they have a postdoctoral fellowship, they should not label it as such.
No. That's only for the purposes of,
Describing the
describing,
duties.
yeah. So we want to make sure that what they're doing is the practice of psychology. So what they call themselves is a different question.
Okay.
How they describe what they do on that form for us, or when they complete their application, is important for us to know that they're actually practicing psychology. Right?
Okay.
So just saying postdoctoral fellowship doesn't describe the psychological services that they're providing.
Got it. And then you also mentioned, it might have related to this, you said something about teaching a class, and that is the practice of psychology, but not, is that or is that not something you can also be supervised on?
It is.
It is.
It is.
And research.
And
Yes.
research, yes.
Okay, so anything counts towards supervision that is
If
under
it
the
is,
scope.
if it is in that definition of what is the practice of psychology, if you're getting supervision while you're doing those things and it's for those things, then you can count those.
Yep.
That's correct.
Thank
And
you.
that is, if you look at the describe in detail, there's a little citation there. And if you just went to that citation on the statutes, you'd see all the things that are listed out by the legislature that constitute the practice of psychology.
Thank you.
All right.
I just have a clarifying question, because when I was going through the licensure process, it was anything over 40, you needed a second hour of supervision.
Right. In
Is that no longer the case for the
2018.
board?
2018's legislature changed that part of the statute. It now says the board can no longer require more than 2 hours a week of supervision, and I think it even says 50 hours total or something like that.
That's rule. So yeah, so the board can no longer require more than 2 hours in a week, except if they're allowing makeup of a missed week hour or hours. And then only, so if you work, let's say 60 hours, the board, by that statute, can only require that you have 2 hours of the applicant have 2 hours of supervision that week. But only 50 of those hours will count toward the licensing, meeting the licensing criteria. And as a supervisor, if they're working 60 hours, you may feel that you would like to see them more for supervision, but we're not requiring a third hour.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering about how to kind of like designate multiple supervisors in a training experience. Like if you had separate supervisors supervising just like distinct clinical experiences, would that be like 2 primary supervisors, or would that be one primary and one designated?
So the statutes and rule are unclear on that particular kind of situation. I'm actually chair of the Rules Committee, and that's one of the issues that we're looking at, trying to create some clarity around those kinds of training situations. We're aware that there are training situations where you can have 4 or 5 supervisors, and you're not going to meet with them all in the same week. You're going to meet with them at different times, depending on what your rotation is that particular week.
Right.
What we're hoping for is that there's some way that we can clarify having one person kind of overseeing that this supervisee is meeting the requirements that they're supposed to meet.
Okay.
And we know that we want them to have 1 hour of supervision that's from a doctoral level licensed psychologist each week.
Okay,
Right,
gotcha.
and that's really, getting at we don't want that experience to happen in silos, where the supervisors aren't communicating with each other to make sure that the individual is well-rounded and competent.
Because what we wouldn't want that supervisee to get is a kind of hodgepodge of an experience for the year. We want those people to be training that individual. Yeah.
Just so I'm understanding, like would it look inappropriate if you had like 2 primary supervisors for 2 6-month periods of time? Or would you want to see 1 primary supervisor for 12
You could have
months?
5 for 6 months if you wanted.
Yeah.
We're not saying you can't do that. We're saying
Yeah.
this is the minimum.
Okay, gotcha. And then could you speak a little bit about what you've referred to as like the tele-supervision or like the use of Google Duo or something like that to facilitate the individual supervision?
So it's face-to-face. It has to be video and audio in real time.
Okay,
So FaceTime qualifies, and if you're not using Apple products, Google Duo,
okay,
I'm told by students, is the most HIPAA compliant platform for that.
Okay.
You need to make sure that what you're doing is, the platform you're using is HIPAA secure.
and that qualifies as just the one, like an individual supervision block?
Right.
That's right.
It's the same
As long
as
as you can see
face-to-face.
each other and it's in real time, what we don't want is
Okay.
for the supervisee to record themselves talking about a client, send that recording to their supervisor, and the supervisor then records themselves talking, giving them feedback about that client, and then sending that. That's not in real time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Looks like we have one over. Oh, got a couple. Great.
That might be outside the scope of what you had in mind, but can you say anything about consultation for licensed psychologists?
What in regards to consultation for licensed
Well,
psychologists?
many people do get consultation after getting
Sure.
their license and probably
Yeah.
should. And any of those elements that you've reviewed, which of those do you think would be most applicable?
Well-
And which would not?
So I guess one way that I'd answer that is consultation is fabulous. Everyone should be doing it. And you need a consultation group that you can be honest with and that will be honest with you and not just give you the answer that you're seeking. I think that there's a pretty high, we see that people who have rigorous and active consultation groups, have better outcomes for their, whether they get into some disciplinary trouble or complaints.
There's no requirement by the board in statute or rule around consultation.
No.
What we do know is that if you find yourself in a sticky clinical situation, that when you seek consultation and document that consultation and create that kind of paper trail for making clinical-wise decisions under consultation from colleagues, you're kind of taking care of yourself.
Maybe I should clarify. More specifically, there is a responsibility when you are supervising on the supervisor. What are the areas of responsibility, or how are they divvied up? For instance, the examples that you just said. Somebody is in a sticky situation, 6 consultations appropriately. Who is responsible? and on what?
I think she's asking, are you asking, just so I can clarify, are you asking that if somebody, if for instance, you're in a sticky clinical situation, you go to a consultation group, you may get bad advice from the consultation group?
Consultation is not always in group. You can also seek individual. So
Sure.
it's not the group or individual, and
Yeah.
not whether it's good or bad. But basically, ultimately, who is responsible? Who is a supervisor? That's the person who is signing off, okay?
Yeah.
If you are seeking consultation, which, as you said, we are encouraging for people to do whether it's sticky situation or not. But let's say something does turn out not as well as you would like it to be. Who is ultimately responsible?
So you're asking a legal question, really, and so I'm not giving you legal advice by answering your question. I just want to be real clear about that. I speak psychology. So in
There
my
is a
mind,
complaint to the
ultimately-
board. That's what
ultimate-
I'm talking
so
about.
whoever's the providers, we're saying this is a licensed provider. That licensed provider has clinical responsibility. If you seek informal consultation, I can imagine an attorney, and they give you advice that turns out not to have been helpful or to be the opposite of helpful. I can imagine an attorney taking that and saying, yeah, we're going to make that the person you consulted with responsible. But ultimately, it's your license that you're seeing that client under, so ultimately there's some responsibility that's on you. If, however, what you did was you paid someone for consultation, then they're providing a psychological service, so they're responsible for the advice they gave you, but you're still responsible for what you did.
There may be some smarter people in the room here than me, but my understanding is that consultants have some protection, and it falls back on the actual provider. But the question that I had, and I apologize if it's in statute, but if we're working on 50-minute hours, is that considered an hour supervision, or how does that work?
Oh, I love that question.
Now it's 45 minutes.
Actually, yeah, the 60-minute hour is 53 minutes minimum, right? 53 minutes at least.
You want to take
The
this one?
rules process is going to probably try to get
gonna
greater
probably
clarity on
clarify
that
that.
issue. The rules process we're in is probably going to try to get greater clarity on that. Sometimes it's better not to have such clarity.
But there have been requests for it.
Yeah.
So we do have, let's see, 2 questions. What is the best way to document hours outside of the attestation form? When will this be submitted?
I think if you have it, how many of you use electronic health records? How many of you have entered your supervisees in there and document it that way? It's really easy because you're already doing it for your clients. It's on your schedule that you're meeting them for supervision. Just turn it into an appointment with a procedure code, and then it's in there. So you need to be able to show when you met, how long you met for, and in general that you were covering topics like what the statute and rule says.
Right.
So, and it's not going to ever be requested unless there are glitches and hiccups. In other words, if the hours that you report don't match with the hours that your supervisee reports in a way that undercuts it, then they're going to probably request those logs.
Yep. Can you come to the microphone, please?
Google spreadsheets. Google Sheets, and share it so that you both have the same record. You're both doing it. You're ultimately responsible for its accuracy. So don't just rely on your supervisee to do it and then accept that. They might enter the data initially, but you have to verify that it's there. And at some point, I lock it at some point.
And this is, that question's regard to if you don't have electronic health records, how do you,
Google Sheets.
Google Sheets, yeah, okay. And then the next question, the other question was, when will this be submitted? So, at the end of the supervisory experience, at the time that the applicant tells the board, this is my supervisor, these are the hours I did, at that point, we contact the supervisor to complete the attestation and tell us what the applicant did under their supervision.
And you have to actually report the hours. So how can you have a count of those hours if you didn't actually count them?
Right, and that's why we're talking about making sure that you're doing that in real time with the counting those hours. Okay. Does it count as supervision if you observe them, i.e. interview, versus they observe you?
this is one of those great things about, this is what makes it fun to be on the board of psychology, because you get all these things you didn't think about, right? I think, bottom line, you have to go back and look at what's the point of supervision. It's about the development of the supervisee, and it's about clinical oversight for the people they're seeing, protecting the public, basically. So I would have a hard time if they're just watching me and they're not doing anything. Like when my supervisees shadow me, I'm having them co-facilitate. I'm turning to them in the session. I may invite them into that session in a way that we have a conversation about what we're just witnessing. Or I'll say, do you have any questions for this person? And so I'm getting an opportunity to observe them with a client that I've been working with. So it's not the same as they're just sitting there watching me.
Second question, what should be included in a supervisor's log of supervision? Statute and rules don't define that.
So it's what do you need to CYA,
Yep,
right?
absolutely.
What do you need? If there's ever a question, what do you want to have to present? And that's what you need to be keeping.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
I may be at the wrong conference and asking something that's not to be covered here today.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Okay. What I'm hearing a lot about are the rules and regulations and the way to quantify the experience by the supervisor and for the supervisee. What about the qualitative experience? What about, what if you're a supervisor who really feels that you're responsible for someone who is not doing a good job? Sure. What if you're a supervisee who feels that their supervisor is not treating them fairly or is being too critical or not available enough? We get the numbers, we get the hours, but what about the actual clinical competence that we're looking for at the end of the experience?
So I think it's a really good question, and I don't think it's out of line to be asking that here at all. So thank you for asking. So it's two questions. One is about kind of the development of the supervisee. How do you provide a really quality experience as a supervisor? And the other question, just to make sure I understand, is what can supervisees do if they feel like they're being mistreated? All right. So that one's the easy one. If a supervisee feels that they're being mistreated, first of all, we want them to be able to have a conversation with that supervisor. In some situations, they might not feel safe to do that. So if there's another colleague that they can talk to make some decisions about what they want to do, they always can then call the board and file a formal complaint, right? So it's kind of the same process as if a client was feeling like they were being mistreated by a psychologist. Same thing. So in terms of development, I think it really is important as we take on the role of being supervisors that we think about what's our orientation as a supervisor. I kind of have a developmental perspective. I add some feminism in there with that, and I'm very much a cognitive behavioral psychologist, so that becomes a big part of what I'm doing. I'm really wanting supervisees to develop us in that postdoc year. I'm hoping they're at a place where they kind of have the clinical nuts and bolts down, and I'm wanting them really to begin to kind of observe themselves in action, be able to be aware of themselves in the moment, and to use their sense of self and their experience of a client to inform the interventions that they select at that particular time. So that's how I work, but how many of you have actually given some thought to how do you help supervisees who are in their postdoc year take that next step in their development in becoming a psychologist and really be intentional about that?
I just want to clarify just one thing. So you've been talking about having the supervisees keep a log, supervisors keep a log, but then also the shared document. Is essentially that all the same thing? So the supervisee is keeping one log, you're just going in and verifying it in real time, and that's all that's needed?
Yeah, it's one log. I actually can just run a report in my EHR also to help me verify that that log is accurate. If I'm going to use that log, I want to make sure it matches with what I know I did.
And then one of the things that I think often comes up is we do a lot of observation work. So let's say we're sitting in on a clinical interview, we're jumping in with questions if we feel like they need to be asked. What does that count towards supervision, or is the supervision and the discussion about that interview afterwards? Where's sort of the line for that?
I would count that. And that shouldn't be the only thing that ever happens in supervision if you're really looking at the development of the supervisee.
Right.
Hi, I just wanted to clarify. I thought I heard you say, and just wanted to make sure I heard, FaceTime and Google Duo are HIPAA compliant.
Those are the ones that we have that I've had students research, and they're the ones that they've said are the most HIPAA compliant.
Okay, so we're
So the
safe
board-
using those.
And I don't use client names when we're using those
No, so
platforms.
the board doesn't regulate HIPAA and whether something is HIPAA compliant, and we don't take a position on
Okay,
what is or is not HIPAA compliant.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much, everybody. This was a great conversation.
So before I launch into this part, I do want to just say a couple things. So the first one is that some of the questions that you're asking, there's some really great books out there for that. And I'm going to just suggest that you do a little looking for that. There's a book, I think it's by Carol Fallender. I'm not 100% sure on that author because sometimes I conflate them, but it's called Getting the Most Out of Your Supervision. And it's a great book for supervisees to look at, to think about how well they could use their supervisor. So if a supervisee is unhappy with the supervision they're getting or not sure how to get it, I think that's a great text. There's books on forms for how to document supervision. And really recently, the APA came out with a series of supervision texts that are by theoretical orientation. And that's sort of a new addition because most of the other texts are more meta-theories from my that's the language I use when I talk about supervision is the meta-theories. So I encourage you to take a look at that because I think there's a great body of literature out there. Okay, the other thing that I thought about this morning when I was listening to the first part was that when you become a psychologist, you don't do it because you want to write case notes. And, right. And when you become a supervisor, you don't do it because you want to keep track of all the numbers and do this stuff. And yet this is a really important part of it, so I'm glad that you're here to talk about it because we all want to support supervisees in getting licensed. And that's really what we're trying to do today is to help everyone help their supervisees get licensed and get licensed efficiently. So I'm Selena Renninger, and I am the chair of the Application Review Committee, which is one of the committees for the Board of Psychology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what our committee does and our roles. Mr. Devin Gilchrist is our public member of the committee, and Dr. Brett Walden is a psychologist member of the committee. And up until just recently, Dr. Michael Bruner worked on our committee. And I've been the chair for about a year, which is about how long I've been on the Board of Psychology. So these are the charges of our committee. So the first one is to review coursework for applicants who are graduating from programs that are not APA accredited. So I don't know about you, but when I went through this process, every applicant had to have their coursework evaluated, and that might have been your situation too. Now, if a student comes from an APA accredited program, it's automatically accepted. We don't review it, we just assume it's appropriate. But for anyone coming from a non-APA accredited program, we need to look at their syllabi. And so that's one of the tasks of this committee, and I'm assuming this committee did a ton of that before. We don't get as much. That's a smaller, I see that as a little bit smaller part of our work right now. The other part that we do is reviewing applications when the staff at the board cannot authorize what is turned in for supervision. The documentation is off in some way, and this committee will review that and make decisions about it. So the two things that can happen is inconsistent with the supervision reported is inconsistent with the law, or the supervision reported by the supervisor and the supervisee don't match. So we talked a little bit about that earlier in the program, and I'm going to repeat a little bit of that in this talk. I think that's okay because I think it really helps us kind of internalize it and keep it all clear. The third area that we would do, and we've done this really infrequently, is review a waiver or variance. There are times when applicants can ask for a waiver or variance to the law, and that's something that we would review. But I'm not going to talk about that today because it's so infrequent. We typically meet on the same day that the board meets, and the board meets 10 times a year, so we meet 10 times a year. Our meetings are 8 a.m. to 9:15 a.m., right before the board meetings, which start at 9:30. We do schedule additional meetings as needed, and we have done that. We're really, I would say, I've been super appreciative to this committee because everyone really wants to help applicants get through. And so we've done that when we know that our docket is too big to get through in our hour and 15 minutes. We've just added an additional meeting. And then these meetings are open. And so you could come and see how we think about these things. It's very transparent. We talk very openly about how we're thinking about the decisions we're making, where we see the problems are, how we're using ethics and law to direct us. And applicants can come. So when an applicant is in a situation where they're getting, as Robin calls it, the hiccups and glitches or whatever she calls them, that we're the people that look at that. Applicants can come and see how we're thinking about their work. The other thing that I want to make sure I say is that we don't know whose application we're reviewing. These are blind reviews, and we don't know who's the supervisor in these situations either. So if there's an issue with a disagreement between the applicant and the supervisor, we have no idea whose application we're reviewing. If we think that we might know the person, if there's something in there that we know about or accuse us where we might think we might know the person, we just recuse ourselves from the conversation. And I think I've had to do that once in the year that I've been here. Okay, so the first thing I'll talk about, I guess the only other thing that I would say is we really hope the new forms also are going to streamline things. We would love to have less work and to have it be better for everybody, the supervisors and the supervisees, and we hope the forms are going to be helpful. Okay, so when we do coursework review, basically what happens is the applicant will decide which of their courses in their transcript fit into the various parts that are required by law, the various content areas. And then they fill out a document that says this course here, this course there, and then they submit the syllabus to the board. And then that comes to us and we review it. I'm telling you this because as a supervisor, if you have a supervisee in this situation, you might want to help them with that task. It might be helpful to get two minds together looking at that. There are some common errors that happen in that process, and it slows things down. How do I want to say this? So I think that there is a grid, there's a document that tells applicants what might be good courses to fit in those areas and what courses might not be good courses in those areas. It's really helpful to use that, and the committee uses that as well to direct our thinking. And this part of the law very much mirrors the APA accreditation guidelines. So most programs that aren't accredited are still trying to meet the APA guidelines in some way so that they know that licensing laws are looking for that. And so most current grads are going to have coursework that fit in these areas. Sometimes I've seen a few recently for people who graduated maybe 20 years ago, and then they might be missing something. And so that becomes an issue. But in any case, some of the common misses I'll tell you about is not including psychometric coursework. So you need 1 credit of psychometrics, 1 of statistics, and 1 of research and design. And many people have more than that, particularly in research design and statistics. But the psychometric piece is often the part where people leave something out, or they put in a statistics course, but it's not actually psychometrics. Another course that sometimes people put in the psychometrics area that's incorrect is an applied assessment course. And this category is not about the application, it's about measurement theory. So that's one area. Another area that we see a fair amount of I don't know if people get, it's kind of, the language is confusing, I think, sometimes to people, but it's called the application of psychological principles to problem identification and to problem solution. And sometimes people swap that. So problem identification, of course, is a diagnostics course or an assessment course of some kind, and problem solution might be a theory course or a skills course. And sometimes people flip those. And it would be lovely if we could just fix that for the applicant and say, we're just going to flip them, but we can't. The way it works is that the applicant has to say what courses they want to go where because it's their degree, and we can't decide for them where they want to put the course. So usually what happens in those instances is that we will ask the board staff to give them a clue where the issue lies so that they can fix that error. Let's see. Okay. So that's coursework review. Now, the other area that we spend a lot of our time on, and this is what I think the first part of the conversation was about, is when supervision is inconsistent by statute or rule. And I'll give you some of the issues that we run into and that we end up discussing. And I'll say that when this committee, which was, I think we were all pretty new about a year ago, we really spent a lot of time trying to make sense of this, and we've kind of come to some conclusions, and now we're much more efficient in making decisions about these things. But these are some of the errors that we see, or issues, I guess issues that I would say we see when it comes to us. So board staff, if there's maybe 3 weeks of supervision that isn't 100% in compliance with law, they don't send that on to us. They deal with that themselves. Once it goes beyond 3 weeks, then it comes to our committee. So that's an initial bar. And then and that was something that we decided seemed reasonable from our perspective in terms of maintaining the law. These are some of the errors. So phone supervision. Now, telesupervision is allowed. We've talked about that earlier today, but that is different than phone supervision. It has to be video, audio, synchronous. So sometimes people have done phone supervision, particularly like one example was there was really bad weather and people were in distances far away. And so we were very happy that they did the phone supervision. It wasn't that we thought that was terrible. We thought that was a good plan given the situation. It just doesn't meet the law, and so we couldn't count those hours during the week that's the kind of supervision that happened, because it happened for several weeks. So if that was a one-time occurrence, that would have been a different situation, but it went on for several weeks. So that's one example. Another is really inconsistent primary supervision. So this was one, I kind of looked through my notes on charts, and this is not, for the ones that we review, something like this is not so uncommon, although it might be surprising to you. Like 35 weeks of no primary supervision. It's very hard to make the case that that was good oversight for the clinical practice. And so then we have to make decisions about what to do. And in this instance, it was also 19 weeks with the designate was inadequate too in terms of the frequency. Another problem that will sometimes come up is that the designated supervisor was not given appropriate oversight. So the primary and the designate never talked. They were completely separate. And that just kind of comes to our attention somehow when the way the paperwork is filled out. And then the board looks at it, the staff, and they're like, this doesn't seem right. And so then it comes to us, and we have to make some decisions on whether it actually met the criteria for supervision. Occasionally, when the primary supervisor needs to be away, they will appoint a non-psychologist to cover as primary. Again, we're very happy that people are wanting supervision to occur. Again, it doesn't meet the requirements for licensure and the profession. And so these are challenges because we really want to support people for doing the right thing, and we can't count those hours. Now, nothing really happens beyond that. We just don't count the hours in those situations, okay? So, say, only cases that exceed a reasonable threshold come to our committee. Let's see, what else do I want to say? I think that's probably it. All right, now another area is inconsistency between the applicant report and the supervisor report. And so, how do you know which one is right? So the example I gave this morning was that my supervisor put in different dates for me when I did this many years ago, or one of my supervisors did that. And so the board came back and said, well, what was accurate? And I asked her, well, why did you put those dates? And she said, well, I estimated. So I'm going to encourage you not to estimate. This is and so nothing bad came of it. It just delayed my licensure by a little bit. But don't estimate. Really, I mean, I think we're talking that we didn't used to have to track in the detail that we are now. We are tracking in much more detail, and it's considered best practice. So we want to make sure you know the dates, the hours reported, and the amount of supervision that you document. So how many hours were they working? How many hours did you supervise? When did you start doing that? Okay. Now, potential outcomes. I think this is important for you to know, because if your supervisee runs into a glitch, you can help them not panic about that. I think as a supervisee, it's stressful and scary when you feel like if it's not working right, or you think you're going to get in trouble, or you think there's a problem. So here's what can happen after our committee looks at things. We might approve all the hours. and then everything's fine. We might approve part of the hours. So if some of the hours don't meet the requirements enough, we'll just say, don't count those, but count these. And I will say that sometimes people have a lot of extra hours. So we might even not approve some hours, but they still meet the 1,800 and they're fine. And then sometimes we'll deny that experience. That experience doesn't count because it really isn't inconsistent with the law. So these decisions either result in a completed application the person moves through, or they need to keep getting supervision. And oftentimes, the time between the application coming in and the time that we review it, they've continued to accrue hours in supervision, and some of the times that's sufficient to get them where they need to go if there's some kind of issue. The other outcome could be a referral to the Complaint Resolution Committee. So I want to talk a little bit about that too, so you will know for your supervisees kind of how we think about that. First of all, applicants are typically not referred to the Complaint Resolution Committee. During the year that I've been chairing this committee and working with the committee, we've not referred one applicant to the Complaint Resolution Committee. So that I haven't yet seen a situation where we have thought that that was a thing we wanted to do or made sense to do, and I'm not sure that I have yet been able to conceive of an idea of when we would do that, because at least from my perspective, I very much think the supervisor is responsible for the supervisee's work. So when there's, at least in the context of supervision reporting, when there's an issue, I look to the supervisor to be providing oversight and guidance around that. So there are other things that supervisees could do that would go to the Complaint Resolution Committee, but not this particular area. And so the other thing is the supervisor, if we think there's an issue with how supervision was happening, there's some clue in there that that's happening in a way that's kind of problematic, sometimes we'll have the supervisor be given notice of rules through Mr. Sands. So he'll contact them, call them, or write them, and give them a heads up on a part of the rules. Like, yes, this came in front of this committee, and here's some things you might want to know. And that's usually for a more minor issue. We just want them to be up to date. And then supervisors are infrequently referred to Complaint Resolution Committee. My memory was somewhere between 1 and 3, and I was told this morning it was 2 in the last year. So there were 2 supervisors that we referred to Complaint Resolution Committee. And the reasons that we referred them to the Complaint Resolution Committee fall into these categories. So either we had reason to believe that the supervisor was going to continue to provide inadequate supervision, and we wanted to find a way to deal with that. So sometimes, I guess, I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this, but I would say that sometimes the way in which a supervisor completes the application suggests that there might continue to be problems with the supervision. And so there's that. And then the other one is reason to believe that the supervisor did not take on responsibility actually for supervision. And again, this is sometimes how the supervisor completed the form and what they said. You get the idea that they didn't really understand that they were responsible for the oversight of the supervisory work. And so a lot of times this falls in the categories of failure to meet or failure to designate someone else who's appropriate to do that supervision, failure to take the responsibility for that. When you choose to be a primary, then you are taking responsibility for that full oversight, including the designate. That's a significant part of the guidelines. So that is what I have, and I think if there's questions, we can go ahead and take those.
2 quick questions. One, when you have a primary supervisor and a delegated supervisor, how do you recommend that they document that communication?
It's a good question. Do you have recommend? I mean, I have some thoughts, but go ahead. I mean, I would just put it in your notes.
In the supervision note.
In the supervision notes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. So that would be the appropriate place to do that as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I often think of this as, particularly for teams where there are multiple supervisors involved and then there's a training person that oversees, that's the other place that could happen. Say there's monthly supervisor meetings. You might want to keep notes from those monthly supervisor meetings that this is when the supervisors got together and all talked about the supervisees in these ways. But if it's just 2 of you and you check in monthly or something like that, I would just document it in your regular notes.
Would you do that in each of the individual, like, medical record files?
So that's the way I
Or-
would do it. I mean, think about one of the things that supervision does is it serves a gatekeeper function. So it could be possible that there would be a supervisor that you have that really has some challenges. And you're working with them, if they have a designated supervisor, you and that designated supervisor are going to want to work pretty closely together to make sure you're helping that person overcome those challenges, or coming up with a plan that counsels them out if that's what needs to happen. And if you're not documenting that along the way, then you're really leaving yourself at risk, right?
Yep.
So think of documentation not just as, okay, what does the board want, but what do you need to be doing to make sure that you're able to say what you did if you were ever asked?
And then the last question, if you have 2 primary supervisors, and they each have a designated supervisor maybe that they're working with at a different rotation, would both of the primary supervisors would fill out one of those attestation forms? Is that right?
Yes,
And then,
that's
so they
right.
might each have half of the hours
Yes.
recommended,
That's
okay.
right. And then
So
we can
together
add-
that they would, got it.
We can add at
Yeah.
at the board and make sure that equals 1,800.
Yeah.
So this may not be a question, but more of a comment. So it sounds like then, if we're working with a postdoctoral supervisee, they're still on site with us as they're getting their documentation together. It sounds like it makes a lot of sense for us to be sitting down with them and completing the paperwork together, right? To make sure that we've got, that it is consistent. I mean, it just seems like that would make the most sense. Or is there concerns about that? Is that part of what you're looking for, to make sure that what I remember and what my supervisee remembers are the same, or?
So, okay, so what I would say is doing that in real time as the supervision occurs is probably the best practice. Not necessarily sitting down and filling the application out together, because we are trying to, make sure that the experience is it shouldn't be, the conversation at the end shouldn't be the first time that you have a conversation about what supervision was provided.
Right, but it does make sense to make sure, like, what date did you say you started? Yes, that's the date that I have that you said you started,
Yes.
right? And then that way, when we're not surprised then hearing
Right.
back that it wasn't consistent.
So I would say that, I think like, we're talking about 2 related intersecting things. So like formative, ongoing, yes, you want to be continually checking hours and authorizing them and making sure. And then at the end, you're going to do some summative stuff. But I also have said that anyone I've ever supervised, that I will not send anything to the board. This was before I was on the board. I would not send anything to the board until we sat down and made sure our numbers matched. And I just think that's a good practice because it sets your supervisee up for success, and then you can make sure that you're in agreement. The other thought that I was having is this piece that I feel like we've kind of talked toward without really naming, but it has come up in some of the questions, and that is, we are all assuming that when you do your postdoc year and you're supervising them, that they're going to successfully complete, and then you're going to attest. And I think there are times when that doesn't happen, and so that becomes a challenge. And so I do want to encourage folks to look at also your supervision contracts and clearly outlining what you are going to do if someone is not successful, and what due process things you have in place for that person, because when you take them on as a supervisee, they are expecting that you're going to sign off on the end, and unless that is clear up front, what processes you have for when it's not going well or you don't think they're performing well, it's better to have them know in advance what you're then going to do, what the limits of your willingness to attest to someone will be, and what you're going to do when you're not able to do that. And so there's also literature out there about that, about how to write good contracts and what should be in them and how to name that. And I think that's very helpful in these situations too. So I don't know, there was just a few comments that made me think about that. Yeah.
Hi, just wanted to ask one more clarifying point, and I know this was said, and I actually just looked it up too. I just really want to make sure I'm right here. So somebody who is a licensed psychologist became a licensed psychologist prior to 1991. They would be able to provide post-degree supervision for a doctoral psychologist.
I'm going to let Sam take that.
Just to double check.
So the question is that date that you looked up, I think it's October.
I think it's August 1st.
Sorry.
Or
August
something
1st.
of.
August 1st, 1991, yes. So if the master's level psychologist was licensed prior to that date, and they're competent in the practice area they're supervising as well as competent in supervision, they can provide supervision under the statutes and rules.
Okay, thank you.
A lot of caveats.
All right. Anything else? Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
So my name is Scott Fisher, and I am the chair of one of the complaint resolution committees. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about the role of the complaint resolution committees in supervision cases. And before getting into some of the specific information about supervision, it's worth knowing a little bit, getting a general overview of the complaint resolution committees, or CRCs, and how they work. So the task of the CRC is to handle any complaints about a rule or statute violation by a licensed psychologist or by an applicant or anybody else in the practice of psychology. And the first step, if the CRC gets a complaint, is what's called a triage process. And that means that the Complaint Resolution Committee looks at the written complaint and make some decision about whether it has merit, whether we want to go forward with that and learn more about it. Many of those complaints are dismissed at that point. And what that means is that it's very possible that some of you have had complaints against your license that you never knew about. They would have been dismissed at a very early point by the CRC. If the complaint has merit, we would gather more information, and the committee has the option of scheduling a conference with the psychologist. And at that point, the committee would meet with the psychologist. Many people choose to have a lawyer present because the investigation is more serious at that point, and then make a decision about how to move forward with the case. And there's several options. So one of them is it could be dismissed. So even though we thought it was serious enough to bring the psychologist in and talk with them, it may be that after hearing their side of the story, it makes sense to dismiss the complaint. Sometimes the committee and the psychologist come to what's called an agreement for corrective action. And that means that there's an agreement that a violation occurred and that something needs to be done about that to ensure public protection and bring the psychologist up to speed. That is an action that is not considered to be a disciplinary action. And sometimes that matters because people are concerned about being on insurance panels and they don't want to have to report that they've been disciplined. However, it is a public document, and it is something that could be accessed through the board's website. Finally, the committee could decide to move forward with disciplinary action, and that's the most serious outcome. And discipline could be, at the most severe end, a revocation of someone's license. There could be less severe discipline, such as a public reprimand or an order restricting somebody's license, say that they're not allowed to do supervision or not allowed to do certain things, or that they themselves need to be supervised. So I said the committee would move forward with discipline. And I said it that way because the committee by itself can't approve a disciplinary action. They can come to an agreement for corrective action, but for discipline to occur, it has to be voted on by the full board. So the committee would bring that as a motion to the full board. And usually the board would approve the committee's motion, but that is not always the case. If the board votes to discipline a psychologist, there is recourse after that. So there is an appeals process, which is actually a little bit a little bit Byzantine, a little bit complicated, and beyond the scope of this presentation, but just know that there is a due process and appeals process from that point forward. So I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of complaints that the Complaint Resolution Committee tends to get regarding supervision. So we've had some complaints about boundary issues, so supervisors trying to establish personal relationships with supervisees, being too casual in their supervision, wanting to borrow money from their supervisees, those kinds of things. Which is really, not only is it a legal and ethical problem, it seems not a very smart course of action. So another kind of complaint that we'd get would be unauthorized or unsupervised practice. And I can talk, one of the case examples that I'll give you a little bit later is about that, and I think you'll understand that one better. And another is inadequate supervision. That should be of an applicant. So that includes some of the things that we were talking about earlier today about not receiving the right number of hours, but it could also include inadequate clinical supervision. All right, so one of the things that I think is going to be important to understand all the material that I talk about going forward is some history of the Board of Psychology enforcement of supervision requirements, because it really was quite controversial a few years ago, and we've done a lot of things to, I think, smooth that process out. So for many years, the board was not very well equipped to check supervision hours. So perhaps there would be a discrepancy between the supervisor and the applicant, but it never came to the board's attention. And so there might be problems, but we weren't aware of them. We got better at tracking and checking those things and began to discover, a fair number of problems, most of which were not major, but were worth looking at. And a lot of them were people not receiving enough supervision hours, not receiving sort of the right apportionment of hours, so they weren't getting 2 every week, concerns about designated supervisors. So it was good that those things were coming to the board's attention, but we didn't have any other process at that point to resolve those things except the Complaint Resolution Committee. And so what was happening is these things were going to the CRC, and we were dealing with a lot of supervision complaints. And this was very unpopular among the community of psychologists. The fact of it was very few of these people were disciplined, and very few even came before a CRC. But they were aware that there was a complaint. It was very stressful for a lot of applicants. It felt heavy-handed. It's like my Uncle Al, who once tried to fix his carburetor with a hammer. He did other stuff too, but that's a different conference, I think. So when that came to our attention, we made some efforts to come up with some other tools that weren't hammers to deal with these problems. And when Sam Sands came on as executive director, that was one of the things that he really took a lot of action on. And so now we have a lot of other ways to deal with complaints and prevent these things from happening without them going to the CRC. And we talked about some of those earlier. One of them is attestation. The other one I just call leeway. So, we talked earlier about board staff. If it's fewer than, is it 3? 3 weeks where the supervision is inadequate, they just let it go. They just send it to the ARC rather than take more action. We're doing more things like this. So education conferences about supervision requirements. And then people know the rules, and we have fewer infractions of the rules. The supervision log that we looked at earlier today is on the board's website, so sort of a more informal education. And so what that means is that the complaint resolution committees are not dealing with very many supervision complaints or the same kinds of supervision complaints that they were dealing with just a few years ago. So in a few minutes, I'm going to give you some hypothetical cases, typical sorts of cases that the CRC deals with. But before getting into those, it's worth talking about some of the principles that would guide our resolution of supervision complaints, or really any complaints. So I think it's helpful, it's a good exercise to sort of put yourself in the place of being a complaint resolution committee member and having to think about how to deal with some of these complaints. What are some of the principles that you're looking at? So the first one is that public protection is central to our mission. That's really kind of the bottom line. That is what we're looking for. Another principle that's important for people to understand is that actual harm isn't required for a violation. So if somebody violated the law, there was very likely the potential for harm, and that is important to the board. We're not the Supreme Court, so we're not guided by precedent legally or officially, but we do value consistency. And so the CRC's aim to resolve cases in a pretty consistent way over time and between the two committees. So there are actually two complaint resolution committees, and each takes half of the complaints that the board receives. And one of the reasons for that is because there's enough complaints to warrant that. But another one is that there might be a case where the complaint was against a psychologist on one of the committees or against one of their close colleagues. And we need to have another committee then take a look at that case. So the two committees, while they don't meet together or confer directly, board staff are present at both of the committee, CRC 1 and 2 meetings, and we do aim for consistency. As we talked about earlier, applicants and licensees are expected to know the law and rules. That sounds obvious, but it's not uncommon for people to come in and tell us they just didn't know a rule and tell us that as though that were a defense. And so it's really important to us that they know these things. And finally, we try to keep in mind that things happen. And that can sound flippant, but I actually mean it in a really serious way. That for each of the two complaint resolution committees, 2 of the 3 members are psychologists. And when I'm listening to the case, I think it's really important to imagine that you're on the other side of the table and the person facing the complaint. And to think about the person's circumstances and if those things might have happened to you, how it might have played out. And I think if you can't summon that level of humility, it's probably not a good committee for you. So there's a certain amount of compassion that we try to bring to the situation. We try to look at the specific circumstances. Things happen. So here's some challenges that come up for the CRCs in handling these cases. One is that there are a lot of gray areas. I think particularly with some of the supervision issues, where there's just a lot of numbers. Did this person receive the right number of hours of supervision? Well, all right, so they missed 4 weeks. That's not that bad. How about 6? How about 9? At what point do you really start to care? So I think gray areas come up a lot. That you can also see gray areas in some of the boundary kinds of complaints. Right? Anybody could have a bad day, could make an insensitive comment. How bad does it have to be before we're concerned about public protection and want to take action? Those are hard questions. The second is, what is the right remedy? So sometimes you could have identical violations, but a complaint resolution committee would handle them in completely different ways. So for example, imagine that you had a complaint about a supervisor, and the supervisor, it was learned, canceled a lot of meetings with their supervisee, would come in late, was inattentive, didn't respond in a timely manner to requests by the supervisee. There were a lot of problems. Now imagine that you bring the person in, they acknowledge those problems, they tell you that they were having an episode of major depression, that they're now taking medication and seeing a therapist and doing a lot better, and that they're consulting with a colleague and they're sort of being monitored, either maybe by colleague or through HPSP or some way to make sure that they have their mental illness under control. Well, perhaps there wouldn't be discipline in that case, but if there was, the remedy would likely to be maybe a psychological evaluation. We might want to hear from their treatment providers. They could be referred to HPSP. Now imagine the same facts. This time the psychologist comes in and meets with the committee and says, first of all, the supervisee is lying. All three of them are lying. Second, I don't know those rules and they're not very important to me because I know how to do supervision. And third, that's all I have to say. So you laugh. So that's a case where you'd handle that very differently. First, there would certainly be some discipline in that case. There might be a public reprimand. There might be a restriction on their practice about supervision. So you can see two situations where the facts that bring them in are the same thing, and yet the remedy and the way the CRC deals with it might be completely different. That's the reason we do a conference, and that's one of the challenges that we have. Conflicting accounts. I think especially in supervision, you may have a supervisee saying one thing and a supervisor saying another thing, and we have to determine who to believe. And anybody who's done any research on how good psychologists are at determining who's telling the truth knows we're not good. We're not good. We're not any better than anybody else. And you want to keep that in mind. So that can be very challenging. And our standard is what's called preponderance of the evidence. So we can take action if we believe it is more likely than not that somebody violated a rule or statute. So that's really different than criminal court where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So trying to figure out, has that burden of preponderance been met, is a real challenge. How much should they have known? I think we don't really see too many applicants in the CRC at all, but what standard would you hold them to as far as knowing the rules and the rules and the statutes regarding supervision, in particular the practice of psychology in general? Some standard, they can't come in and say, I knew nothing, but I think you think about it a little bit differently than you would somebody who'd been in practice for 20 years. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few case examples that are, none of these are real cases, but they're similar to real cases, or I've mixed some facts around. They're definitely representative of the kinds of supervision cases that we would see in the CRC. So here's the first one. So this is a unlicensed practice case. So imagine that an individual applied to the board 10 years ago, and they got the required supervision, but then they failed the EPPP a few times. And their application has been inactive since that time. And they report that they're getting continued supervision, but they're no longer an applicant of the board. And so they do not meet that exception for an applicant of the board. and therefore they're technically practicing psychology without a license because they're not a licensee or an applicant. We'll go forward and we can talk about these later if people are interested. Here's another one. So this is a case of inadequate supervision. So an applicant reports that they received only 1 hour of supervision from their supervisor per week, and that was it, and they didn't know they needed more. The supervisor is asked about this, delays responding to the board for several months, and then says the applicant actually received 2 hours as required by the law. When asked about the discrepancy, the supervisor says that 1 hour was spent in administrative tasks, such as answering calls and checking on insurance claims. So that's a case where the supervision was very much inadequate, and you have a supervisor who is perhaps evasive, and that might change the way that you think about that case. Here's a closer call. So imagine a situation where the applicant didn't receive the required 2 hours of supervision per week on 6 occasions over the course of 1 year. On 2 weeks, the supervisor was on vacation. On 1 week, they were both at a conference. On 1 week, the supervisee was ill, and on 2 weeks, they can't remember what happened anymore. They don't have a record of it. So those kinds of cases are interesting. If you think back to the point that I made about gray areas, you know, that's not great, and it's not great that they didn't have a record of those 2 weeks. On the other hand, is it really a public protection issue? And on the other hand, is it kind of a slippery slope to even more serious problems? So those kinds of cases can be challenging. So here's, we've talked mostly today about supervision hours and requirements, but here's a case of boundary issues. So imagine that you have a case where 2 female supervisees complain that their supervisor, male, made inappropriate comments beginning in the last 3 months of their supervision period. And they both acknowledged the supervisor was competent and helpful and respectful throughout their supervision experience through the first 9 months, and there were no incidents. They both described similar experiences, including comments on their appearance, jokes about clients being sexually attracted to them, and once commenting that if an applicant was not a supervisee, he might pursue an affair with her. So those are, I mean, it's obviously an infraction. It's something that there's going to be action taken, but the details become really important. We would want to know what happened in those last 3 months. The credibility issue that I talked about earlier is maybe less important because we have 2 people coming forward making similar allegations. So those kinds of boundary issues come up at times. So at this point, what I would like to do is open it up for questions about the CRC's role or any comments about these scenarios, or failing that, if people have any other questions about the earlier parts of the presentation. We've got a little bit of time left for all of that, I think. Sam just whispered good luck with that before I read the question. I don't even know if I want this one. We'll try it. Do you foresee insurance CMS changes not allowing for trainee services to be billed, reducing the availability of postdoc training opportunities? Dr. McLeod is whispering that she's going to get me off the hook on this one. Go for it.
Like I said, good luck.
Okay, so this is not a board position. It's obviously about kind of what's happening to the profession as a whole. And if you follow what the American Psychological Association is doing, they're actually working with CMS to get trainees funded, their services funded through Medicare. It's a big push that they're doing. So Minnesota is one of the few states where we actually do have trainees that can get compensated. So I don't think that they're going to back away from what's happening. If anything, it's going to keep moving even more.
That's helpful. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that the board has been in a transition over the past couple of years and doing things differently.
Yes.
And I just wanted to publicly thank you guys for that, because I think it's made a real difference.
You're welcome. I personally would take about 1% credit, and I think Sam should get a lot of credit for that. So if you want to applaud again, you could do that for him.
Would you please repeat again, when a case is dismissed, is it or is it not in the public domain?
Great question. It is not.
Thank you.
Another question?
This is back to supervision hours and primary supervisors. I think you gave this information, but just wanted to confirm if you have like 4 separate rotations over a year, it's okay to switch the primary supervisor for each time that you have that, as long as they all add up.
As long as they have primary supervision, it's fine to rotate who the primary is during that time frame. They just have to know they're the primary so that they know that they're in charge of collaborating with the designated supervisors at that point in time, and that they're willing to fill out the attestation forms for us.
And that they have kept accurate records of start and stop dates and numbers of hours that match with what the supervisee has documented.
Got it. Thank you.
On the one example of practicing without a license for health reasons or whatnot, what would be some of the response of the board to that?
To the example case that I gave?
Say because of health reasons or whatnot, the supervision wasn't continued, and the person continued to practice for a period of time. What would some of the scenarios for responding?
All right, so you're saying that the person was under supervision, the supervisor had health issues, and
No, the supervisee.
The supervisee had health issues.
But continued to practice because difficulty scheduling and other demands.
So are you saying that they didn't receive supervision during that time, or that they're...
That's correct.
Okay, and how was that related to health issues? They had difficulty scheduling and getting to supervision?
Right.
So I'm really cautious about commenting on what might be a real case when we don't have all the facts. What I would say is that, in general, a person who has enough time and enough health to be practicing psychology would also be expected to save some of that time and energy for supervision. I would also say that the things happen principle may be operative, and that we would want to hear about their specific situation before making any decision.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Fisher.
I just want to say a couple of closing comments. So I've been the chair of the board since the beginning of this year, 2019. I've been on the board now for 2 years. And as I've watched this board grow and evolve, one of the things that strikes me most is that, first of all, the staff behind the scenes, while there's been some change, some turnover, Sam came on as executive director. There's been turnover in staff who process applications. The people who do the investigations of the complaints are really dedicated to getting facts before the board. And my goal is, the way I look at our board is we have a lot of really smart people, and if we get the right information in front of us, I trust that we're going to together make some wise decisions. And that's kind of the direction this board is going. But all of the psychologists on the board, we're your colleagues, and we're the people that the governor has said, we want you to regulate your profession. So having psychologists do that, I believe, is really, really important. So don't forget that piece, and be nice to our staff, because they work really hard.
Thank you. If you just turn in your evaluation sheets to staff members, they will give you your certificate. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.